Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at the IULM University, Milan. He has been Fulbright Visiting Scholar at MIT. He is executive editor of the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness, has published several books and many papers on the topic of consciousness. His current research focuses on the issue of consciousness and the structure of reality and the world. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. Today in my talk, I would like to address the issue of consciousness and then to suggest a possible solution. But first of all, I would like to make it clear why consciousness is such a big problem today, both in science and in technology. That today is easier to talk of artificial intelligence than to talk of artificial consciousness. And that's a little bit strange because if you look at natural evolution, if you look at animals, it seems that somehow the ability to feel is one of the first things that we have in animals. So it is kind of easy to have, say, a mice that is able to feel pain, that is conscious of what happens to him, but it's not that easy to find mice, or to find simple animals that are able to, say, play chess or to be particularly intelligent in the traditional sense. That's a key question today. What is missing in order to replicate fundamental fact of our everyday life, namely the fact that we have an experience of the world, that we are conscious. What is our consciousness made of? The more machines become intelligent and the more mysterious consciousness appears to be. So let me make you an example that I use with my students in the beginning of all my class. Today, if we take let's say, phone, the phone is able to recognize our face. Face recognition is no longer a big deal. All average Photoshop programs are able to recognize faces, and they do that in a very reliable way. But I don't think that the phone sees me. I don't think that the phone, that if I put the phone in front of me in a mirror when I'm taking a shower, I don't feel as though someone is looking at me. Why? Because the phone is not conscious, at least so in machines today something is missing. We must ask the fundamental question, the key questions. What is missing in AI from designing and building a conscious machine? And this is not only a theoretical question. I mean, I'm the co-editor of a journal called Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness, where researchers from everywhere in the world are trying to figure it out, a possible model of consciousness. But so far, no one has been able to explain how consciousness can be created by either a machine or by a biological being. The fact is that this problem is not only a problem in AI, it is also a problem in neuroscience. So, for example, if we take into consideration, for example, most neuroscientific books about consciousness, we may be puzzled, may be surprised by the fact that so far there's no scientific explanation of consciousness. Doesn't matter how much we know about the brain, how much we know about the neural activity in the brain, there is not a single explanation as to how or why the neural activity is associated with conscious experience. So, for example, this picture behind me is taken from a 2004 book by Christoph Koch. Christoph Koch is one of the most famous neuroscientists in the world, and today he's working with Giulio Tononi, another Italian interested about making a model of conscious experience. And you can see, I always use this picture because it provides a very clear idea of the state of the art of today's research on consciousness. So in this picture, we have the external world here, represented by the environment, a dog, a tree, people walking. And then we have the, of course, the information, the light going in the brain. the activity in the brain, which is studied, and neuroscientists are looking for the so-called NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness. So they are looking for those particular neural activities that take place when we are conscious of something. So in this case, for example, I'm conscious of a dog. There is some activity in my brain, going on in my brain, and then whenever there is this activity, I am aware of the dog. And I have an experience of the dog. What is the problem? What is missing in this picture? The last step. Nobody has a clue as to why this neural activity must produce anything like our conscious experience. In all neuroscientific papers published as of today, there's not a single explanation or solution as to how this activity must become anything like that. In fact, this is called the hard problem, meaning that even if we were able to know everything, to understand everything about the activity here in the brain, we will still be unable to explain why such an activity becomes this experience. So in other words, everything we know from neuroscience is just everything we know from artificial intelligence. When you study artificial intelligence, how to build a face recognition system in a phone, or when you study AI in order to understand how a machine can, for example, navigate in the environment, can drive a vehicle, can move a hand, can grasp an object, can control a robot, you don't care about conscious experience. You care only about input and output. And of course, you want that output to be as intelligent as possible, because you need to control the body, you need to control the movement, you need to control all the information, you need to recognize people. Who cares about adding the extra ingredient in a machine of consciousness? The problem is that when the machine is us, when we are the machine under scrutiny, we know that we are conscious. If you have doubt about that, if you are one of those people that say the consciousness is just an illusion, I ask you to go to the dentist, and when the dentist offers you to do the anesthesia, you must reply, oh, no, I don't care about anesthesia. Consciousness is only an illusion, is just a theoretical mistake. I doubt that many of the people that claim the consciousness is an illusion would be strong in their beliefs to refuse anesthesia. So basically, anesthesia is just a mean to get rid of consciousness. And we know that it works. So you may counter-argue, but we know a lot about anesthesia. Yes, we know a lot about the association between certain drugs and the suspension of consciousness. However, we don't know exactly why the change in our neural activity caused by those drugs should result in the lack of consciousness, because we don't know what is consciousness. Neuroscientists have been looking inside the brain with fMRI, with EEG, with direct neural recordings, but so far, as I said, the neural everything we know about neural activity tells us only that neural activity is useful in order to control our behavior. Everything may take place in the brain without any consciousness. Now, let me then try to consider why it is so difficult and where we could go for a solution to this problem. Here we have, this is an apple. It's not a particularly nice image, but you may understand. This is an apple. This is the picture of an apple. And this is an apple in the external world. And then we have a body. You can see I put it here like an X-ray just to make it clear that it is like a machine. So we don't see the skin, we don't see the expression, we don't see the human being. We see the machine. And inside such a machine, of course, we have a brain. And we know that the brain does many wonderful things. And the prevailing model today of the activity in the brain is to see the brain as a computational device. A computational device has to do with information. So here I put a lot of information. What is the problem? The problem is that information, look at the information here, is not like our experience. Information is not like consciousness, is different from consciousness. Yeah, you can say the information is interpreted in order to give rise to our consciousness. But who interprets information? I mean, if you say that someone interprets information as consciousness, you are committing a fallacy. It is the fallacy, has two names, this fallacy. One is the fallacy of the homunculus. So you believe that inside the brain, someone is interpreting the information in the brain as though it was consciousness. That doesn't make any sense. Or you can say that somehow in the brain, someone is giving to consciousness a meaning. This fallacy in philosophy and in science is called it has many names. One name is the homuncular fallacy, and another name is the circular fallacy or infinite regress. Namely, in order to explain something, you add something else, and then you have to keep adding other entities. This fallacy is famous because the example of the turtles. So in the past, people believed that the earth needs to be supported by someone, so it was supported by elephant, then the elephant needs to be supported by someone else, it was supported by a turtle. But who was supporting the turtle? And nobody knew. And of course, this is called infinite regress. In our case, the infinite regress is that if I need to have someone inside my brain to give meaning to the information, then I would need someone inside that someone in order to give meaning to the information. So we have a kind of infinite regress. The fact is that if you look inside our brain, we see only neurons, or if you are of, let's say, if you come from AI, you have only information. And information is nothing like our experience of the world. What is our experience of the world made of? Our experience of the world is made of colors, is made of objects, you see, is made of people, is made of colored objects like this apple. It is made of properties that we don't find inside our brain, neither from a physical perspective, because if we watch inside the brain from a physical perspective, we find only, let's say, neurons, blood, and glia, nor from a computational perspective. Because if we watch inside our brain, we find only information from a computational perspective. And as I always say, information has no color. I mean, you're all, I assume most of you are from AI or from some kind of a scientific background. Now, or technical background. Now, imagine that you open a file and you watch inside a file of, say, a picture, an image. Do you find the colors inside that file? No, you're going to find only information. And the information inside the JPEG file is not colored. I know you say, of course, it's not colored. But where is the connection between color and the information inside your file, your JPEG file? The connection takes place whenever you use that information to drive, for example, a computer screen. So when you use that, let's say you take a pictures of yourself and then you watch the pictures on your screen, at that very moment, the information inside your mobile phone is used to drive the screen of your phone to produce physical colors. But when we are the machine, we don't have a screen in our brain. We don't have a way to translate the information inside our brain into the properties we have an experience of. So where do we get? I don't know if you can see the image. So this is quite an allegory. So we have the traditional idea. So we have the world as the source of information. Then we have the senses as snakes, as the idea. This allegory is based on a famous word called, introduced by a psychologist, Greg Miller, but then used by Daniel Dennett, and then used by Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi in AI and neuroscience, that suggests that we are like we are creatures that we are eating information. Literally, we are informavores. You know, there are carnivores, herbivores, and there are informavores. So creatures that eat information. So according to this idea, through the senses, we get information about the world. But as I told you, information is meaningless. We know that from Shannon. Meaning is not something we will deal with. Meaning has to somehow be already available inside the machine. That's what Claude Shannon in 1949, in The Theory of Communication, his famous book, when he started the theory of information, on which all computer science is still based today, this is what Claude Shannon said. So we have information, we get information from the world. We receive information through our inputs, through our sensors. Then we have information inside the brain. And then people expect that somehow, by means of processing such information, we get what? We get the feeling of the world, the conscious feeling of the world, made of its colors. But these colors that we have an experience of, where are they? How can they be created by numbers without any physical counterpart? How can you create colors from a JPEG file, from a bitmap, without connecting that bitmap with a physical object that is physically able to produce colors? Because this object is able to produce colors by emitting different light waves. This is why today nobody is able to explain what consciousness might be. This is why we're still stuck with this picture. And we don't know how colors or taste or anything we have an experience of can be created inside the brain or inside a machine. This is where I put forward a radically different idea. The radically different idea I want you to consider, and like all radical hypotheses, at first it may sound quite bizarre and controversial, if not utterly wrong, is the idea that maybe if we haven't been able to find consciousness or to find an explanation about consciousness, is because we have been looking in the wrong place. The example of the turtles that I made at first, I think is quite a good one, because it is a perfect example of the wrong approach to a problem that prevent people from finding a solution to a problem. In that case, the problem was, what is supporting the earth? Everything is falling down. What is supporting the earth? And then they said for elephant. But then what is supporting those for elephants? And then they said a tortoise. And then they went on and on forever. The problem was that even if you were able to find them, the solution was not yet a good one, because you would need other animals forever. It was an infinite regress. It was a false problem. The problem was in the question. Likewise, it might be that today, when we continue to look for consciousness inside the machine, inside the brain, we are simply looking in the wrong place. We are simply looking, that's why we are not able to find an explanation about how the brain produces consciousness, because maybe the brain does not produce consciousness. Maybe the brain has a role in bringing consciousness into existence, but consciousness is simply not here. So it might be that consciousness has always been hidden in plain sight. That consciousness has always been around, but not where neuroscientists have been looking for it. Let me ask you a question. Let's consider a simple case. So right now you perceive an apple. Let's suppose that this apple is not on your screen, but that this apple, let's suppose that it's just in front of you. It is in your room, in front of you. You just bought an apple. It is red, round, and shiny. What is your experience made of? At this very moment, what properties do you find in your experience? I assume that if you're not colorblind, if you are more or less like me, your experience is of something being red, round, and shiny. So we have a physical object that has such properties. This is the apple. At this very moment, the information goes from the apple to your eyes, and from your eyes through the optical nerve to your brain. Fine. In the brain, unfortunately, we don't have anything like the apple, but you have an experience of the apple. So neuroscientists, what do? Neuroscientists begin to look for in the brain, to look for something like your experience in the brain, and they don't find anything like your own experience. But right now, is there an object, a physical thing that has just the right properties of your own experience? Yes, there is. It is here. It is in front of your nose. It is the apple. The apple is just like your own experience of the apple. I will say a little bit more of that, but for the moment, with some give or take, let's assume that that's true. So at this very moment, your own experience of the apple is very much alike the apple. So the hypothesis that I want to put forward is that the identity of consciousness is not with the brain, but holds with the external object, namely the apple. This hypothesis at first may look completely crazy, because we are used to think that we are inside our brain, that we are inside our body. And that's why neuroscientists have been looking for our conscious experience inside our body. That's a very strong prejudice that we have. We believe that somehow we are hidden inside our body. When I speak with someone, my prejudice is that I am speaking with someone inside that body. That's a psychological common idea. I think that 99% of people believe that. However, if you look inside the body, you don't find anything like the person you're speaking with. If you look inside the body, you find many interesting stuff, beautiful machine. You find bones, muscles, neurons, and the like. But you don't find anything like me. If you were able to crack open my skull right now and keep me alive and see what's going on inside my body, you wouldn't find anything like me. And in fact, in neuroscience books and the like, to convince you that you are inside the body, look at if I tell you that when you speak with someone, you think that you're speaking with some homunculus inside the body, you may say, Riccardo, but you are very naive. Nobody is so naive. But let's look at the images that they put on neuroscience books to convince us that we are inside the body. They put a nice light a sparkle of light, a very soul-like a source of light. That, of course, we know there's no source of light in the brain. I mean, what is this image meaning? I don't know. I think that if I was a naive layman, I would think that I am that light. And there are also many science fiction movies like Ghost in the Shell with Scarlett Johansson that strengthened this idea, or Inside Out by Disney, or Soul by Disney Pixar, that keep forcing this idea. But the fact is that if we look inside the brain, we don't find anything like this light, this nice sparkles of light going on in the brain. We find only a brain, which is a wonderful machine, but it's not the right kind of machine to be like our experience. Now, I ask you, if you look inside you, what do you find? Are you not getting out of your body immediately? I mean, if I ask you, tell me what's your experience made of right now, I'm sure you will tell me it's made of the computer screen, of the window, of my room, of my books, of my everything which is around me. And everything you mention is something outside of the brain. 90% of times is something outside of your body. But sometimes the body may be an object of your experience. So you can see your hand with your eye. You can lick your hand. That's not particularly elegant to do, but you can imagine I could lick my hand, so I could perceive my hand with my tongue. Or I can touch one hand with another hand. So the body can be perceived. But when I perceive the body is external to whatever I am. But there's a part of the body that I never perceive, the brain, which is the part of the body that, according to neuroscience, I should be. Is this not surprising? So there are two options here. One option is to continue with this idea and to continue to look for some emergent property inside the brain, because the brain is such an incredible machine, so complex, but nobody has an idea why complexity should produce a new physical property, by the way. Or because we are just narcissists. And here I like to quote Freud, when he mentioned that the human beings like to think that their brain is special because it's the last defense for our narcissism. We believed we were special in the universe, and then Copernicus told us, no, forget that. We are just at the periphery of the Milky Way, which is just a second order galaxy nobody cares for. And then we believe to be in the center of the animal kingdom. And then Darwin came and said, no, forget that too. I mean, we're just an offshoot of monkeys and whatever, just a branch of evolution. But we still believe, well, okay, we gave up everything, but we are still like our brain is still something special. Our brain does something that nothing else does in nature, namely produces our conscious experience. Well, and here, and that's more or less the position of neuroscientists. They keep telling us the brain does something that nobody else does. The brain is bigger. They always quote Emily Dickinson. Neuroscientists read, it seems that they read only one poet in their life, Emily Dickinson. Why? Because Emily Dickinson wrote a poetry that says the brain is larger than the sky. And so neuroscientists said, okay, this is our champion. We love her. But the fact is that the brain is just an object. And our experience is nothing like this object. So I am asking you to consider the apparently radically new idea that there are two objects, and the problem is so difficult because we insist to consider the wrong one. What if we are just the apple? All of a sudden, everything is super simple. Why our experience of the world is red, round, and shiny? Because it is made by an object which is red, round, and shiny. But then there are two objections. So for a moment, you could take into consideration this really, really radically different idea. Namely, that we are not the activity taking place inside the brain, but we are everything else. We are the room, we are the apple, we are the face of our friends. The two key objections to this radically different hypothesis, which is called, by the way, the mind-object identity. That's the idea behind, I think it is better than my book, my book in 2017 is called The Spread Mind. I decided to use a different word, a different name for my theory, which I think is better. It is less misleading. It is the mind-object identity. Namely, the idea that the experience of an object is identical with the object itself, rather than being identical with the activity in the brain. So, first, let me stress you one thing. This is not a philosophical sleight of hands. This is not a philosophical conceptual trick. This is an empirical hypothesis with empirical consequences. So it is empirically verifiable and falsifiable. As we will see, for example, one consequence is that it is impossible to have, and this is a big prediction of this theory, this hypothesis, that it is impossible to have an experience of a property that we haven't met in the real world. So, for example, according to this hypothesis, a congenitally blind subject will be unable to experience colors, no matter how much information we give them about colors, no matter how much time we spend speaking with them about colors or by means of other stuff. So in order to have an experience of a physical property, you need to be in contact with such a physical property. So the core idea here is that everything is physical. Okay, fine. I told you there are two objections immediately to these questions, to this hypothesis. First objection: if our experience is made by an external object, how is that we all see that object in different ways? How is that maybe I feel this apple cold, while maybe that you've been outside in the cold air, and then if you touch the apple, you feel it warm? How is that we all see the world in different ways? This is the objection of subjective variability. Namely, that we all seem to have a subjective experience. How is that? It seems that my hypothesis is not able to explain subjective variability, which is the main reason why people started to think that their experience was private and inside their head. Because people started to say, well, I see the world in one way, you see the world differently, my friend sees the world in a completely different way. And so the simplest explanation is that each of us has a private, subjective, virtual world. That's the idea behind the idea of subjectivity. I will provide you very soon an answer to that, a completely different answer. But I want to mention the second objection. The second objection is dreams or hallucination. How is that? There are cases in which we seem to have a perfectly a complete, a full-fledged conscious experience of the world, as when we dream, and still we are in a dark room in the dark. So how is that I can dream of an apple when there are no apples around? And the usual solution is that it's because we live inside a bubble of created by our brain. So we never see the reality, but we always live in this virtual reality world. Fine. Let me quickly try to answer to both answers. So first, the first one is, how is that the world that we perceive looks different to each of us if the world is the external world? Now, there is a very simple explanation. And this explanation comes from physics, not from philosophy or from AI, from physics, from the first year of physics, dynamics. We all know that, for example, velocity is relative. So if I ask you, is this apple still or moving right now? You would not be able to reply, because this apple is still relative to my body, but is moving relative to the moon, is moving at an even different speed relative to the sun. So this very apple at this very moment has umpteen infinite relative velocities. It is moving everywhere. Only I am aware only of one of such velocities. Which one? The velocity relative to my body. So this is just a table, just to make this point even clearer, but it should be clear to everyone, it should be quite obvious, that the same object will have a different relative velocity relative to different objects. And each object has a different relative velocity relative to everything else. So the idea is that the world is a little bit more complex than we thought it was, because the world is not made by object with an absolute property, but it is made by object with billions of relative properties. Can we use this example, for other properties? Yes, we can. For example, weight. Take weight. I can say that this apple weighs, say, 100 grams. Yeah, relative to the Earth. But right now, it has a weight relative to the sun, which is much bigger. It also has a weight relative to my body, because there's always gravitational pull. So at this very moment, this apple has umpteen different weights in all directions. Only we take into consideration only the one that is more practical for us walking on the earth, namely the weight relative to the ground, to the earth. But there are plenty weights, relative weights. Or let me make another example, color. So if I put a white picture on my phone, and I ask you, what is the color of the screen of the phone? You say, it's white. If I watch, well, I don't have, let's put Google. Google is whitish. Okay, you screen. Sorry. Okay. I can do it. Okay. Anyway, it's your phone. Terrible. Okay, here you can see it's white. Okay, now it's white. You look at the screen and you say it's white. Yes, but what if I get closer and closer to the screen of my phone? That's what I would see. Look at what's happened when I get closer and closer to the screen of the phone. If you get close enough, you're gonna see the red, green, and blue LEDs on top of the screen. So the screen at this very moment is both white and a matrix of is both white and red, blue, and green at the same time. Why do we say that it is white? because relative to an average human body with average eyes at an average distance, which is the one for which the phone has been designed, the relative color of the phone is white. But if we had either a super powerful high resolution eye, let's suppose that our eye has a resolution 100 times bigger, or we were just closer and closer to the screen, we would say, no, it's not white. It's red, green, and blue. Which one is the correct answer to what color is the screen? There is no correct answer. They're both correct, they're both right relative to a specific body. If you change the body, you change the relative property that you pick up. Or, and that's, consider this example here. We have myself on the beach, and I'm watching the sunset. So here there's the line of the sun. But if I move, look at what happens. The light of the sun moves with me. So the light of the sun is always just at the center of my visual field. Why? Because it's relative to the position of my body. So where is the sea shining at sunset? From a physical perspective, it is shining everywhere. We are aware only of this line because the properties of the optical phenomenon are such that I single out, that my body singles out only a particular stripes of the sea surface. But in reality, that's the outcome of the fact that the world I live in is always the world as it is relative to my body. And this is not a subjective world. This is a relative world, as in physics. In physics, we don't speak about subjective velocity. If I drive my bike at 50 kilometers an hour and I smash against a truck going at 50 kilometers an hour and I crash at 100 kilometers per hour of relative velocity, there's nothing subjective in the bump that I have. It is just relative. So the idea, to cut a long story short and to reply to the first objection, is that the world is relative. If the world is relative, we can bring the subjectivity, we can bring what the tradition has called subjectivity into the external world. There's no longer any need to have an internal subjective world. There is just the external world which takes place relative to our bodies. Since we all have a slightly different body, we all live in a slightly different relative world. So we can explain subjectivity by means of the external world. We are left with the second objection. How is that sometimes we have an experience like in dreams or hallucination of something which is not in front of us? And the solution that I propose has to do with, once again, from physics, from Einstein. Simultaneity, the now, is relative. That's the biggest discovery behind spatial relativity. That there's no way in physics in which two objects takes place at the same time. Simultaneity, the now, the present, is relative. This means that what we, let's say, what we take to be the now is just relative. So it is possible that when I look at an object, the object is at a different position in space-time. So when I look at the apple is just a few milliseconds from my body. Whatever happens to the apple is immediately sent to my eyes and then to my brain. But when I look at the bigger apple, for example, the moon, which is just a bigger apple, which is 1.5 seconds let's say 300,000 kilometers, so it's much farther away. When something happens on the moon, it takes 1.5 seconds, more give or take, to produce an effect in my eye. Why? My eyes. Why? Because light takes 1.5 seconds to reach my eyes. But is the moon not in my present? When I am walking on the beach and I'm just staring at the moon, yes, it is there. It is just there like the apple. And what if it is noon and I watch the sun? The sun is 8 minutes away from me, but is the sun not in my present? Yes, it is just in the present. And between the sun, the moon, and the apple, there's no threshold, there's no magic threshold, there's a continuity. It is just, let's say, a practical fact that with the apple, it is in space-time so close that they can grab it and they can do whatever I want. But there's always a delay. If an object is very close to me, but is moving very fast, it is just like the moon. So that's why we cannot grab a fly mid-air, because the fly is moving randomly at a speed which is greater than the time gap between the position of the fly and the activity in the brain. So unless I do some prediction, as in predictive models, I can do it. So I can only guess. So, and that's basically the reply that I give to the problem of dreams and hallucination, namely that when we dream or we have a hallucination, we are just perceiving our past. And that's why we don't find anything in our dream whose components are not present in our previous experience. If we describe what we find in our dreams, we find components, colors, tastes, people, noses, ears, elements that are just part of our everyday life. I believe there are three, and that's the end. I'll let you ask me anything you want to ask. So the traditional idea was that we are different from our body, but we are a soul, as in the card. The subject perceives the object, but nobody knows what is the subject. It's a soul, but what is a soul? We don't know. Then neuroscience suggested a different solution. The brain perceives the objects. Problem is that the brain doesn't seem to be the right object, because we don't find in the brain anything like our conscious experience. Finally, this is my approach. And the approach that I suggest is that there is an identity between our experience and the external object. This is completely physicalist. I don't suppose the existence of anything which is not physical. Everything in this view, in this framework, is completely physical. Only the hypothesis is that we are not inside the brain, but we are in the world. We are the world as it takes place relative to our body. Thank you. Sorry for being a little bit longer than I expected.
Thank you for the presentation. It was such a pleasure to listen to you. Yes, now we can get your questions. If there is any, please raise your hand.
Don't hesitate to make objection. When we do an experiment, this is a very interesting question. When we do an experiment, we have the external world or a part of the world, and the external world is producing an effect on a measurement instrument. So, for example, I have an object and I put the object on a scale, and the weight of the object changes the scale. And I have something moving in response to the object. There is no observer bias in anything that happens like that. There's always cause and the effect. The observer bias is the offshoot of putting that phenomenon in relation with a conceptual framework. So, of course, when we have a conceptual framework, we choose how to connect different physical phenomena. And by doing that, we make choices, and these choices may be wrong or right. But let me put it this way. An instrument of measure is never wrong. It may be, so even a scale that doesn't move in the right way is always right. because what is wrong is the meaning that we give to the position of the needle of the scale. But from a physical perspective, everything that happens is always right. So the idea is to put ourselves no longer in the place of the effect, but in the place of the cause. We usually think that our experience and our measurement of the world is the effect of the world. And I am suggesting that whenever we are interacting with the world, it's not that you see this sentence, and then I'll get to the other question. When we say, I am interacting with the world, I is a mysterious entity. The interaction between a mysterious entity and the world is mysterious too. The only thing that is not mysterious is the world. So I'm just asking you to turn upside down your conceptual framework and to see yourself no longer in the place of the effect, but in the place of the world that causes effects. Yeah, I see another question. I can read it myself. What about influence of, so this is more or less, but of course, this is the problem of the observer is a giant problem. And it would be nice to see how my hypothesis fits very well, for example, with quantum mechanics, where the problem of the observer is key whenever we have, let's say, a measurement. And whenever we have a measurement, the object of the measurement is defined. And that's completely coherent with my theory. It would be great to go through it, but of course we cannot do it now. It would require a whole day to at least half an hour to go to the relation with quantum mechanics. What about, so let me skip to the other question. What about the influence of emotions of a person on the perception of something? Great question, because emotions usually are considered to be the quintessence of subjectivity or of an inner world, at least in our cultural model of ourselves. But emotions are, as far as we know, a physical state of our body. So emotion, if you take James Cannon or even Ledoux, are always the expression of a different physiological state of our body. So, for example, when I am aroused, my heart rate is higher, my adrenaline is different, the balance between the neuroreceptor in my brain is different. So I change the body. So an emotion is a way to change the state of our body. Now, you remember what I told you, that the world, which the external world, is relative to our body. So if we change our body, we also change the external world. Just like, think about the simplest analogy I made, velocity. If I change the velocity of my car, for example, when I'm driving on the highway, I change the relative velocity of all other cars. So emotions in this model are a way to change the state of the body and therefore to change the properties of the external world, because they're relative to the state of my body. Let me put it in one more, yet another way. We can see the body as the causal reference frame relative to which the world exists. Reference frame is a notion taken from physics. So if I change the reference frame, I change all properties. Okay, if I change the state of my body, I change all the properties that exist relative to that reference frame. So for me, emotions are a way to change the reference frame, relative to which the world we are identical with takes place or exists. What are the consequences of mind-object identity theory to constructing artificial intelligence? Yeah, I like that. Yeah, the consequences are that we are no longer interested in a computational approach. So in neuroscience, but also in AI, a very strong tradition about artificial consciousness is to look for some kind of spatial computational processing that for some reason should create conscious experience. So if we adopt that approach, we will focus on computational theories of consciousness. We will focus on different information structures. On the other hand, if we follow my approach, we will focus on the causal connection between the external world and the body, which may be an artificial body. The good news is that in this approach, there's no need to have a biological body, because our experience is the external world as it takes place because of the interaction with our body. So our body is just a machine, which is very consistent with AI, to see our body just a machine. But we add an extra ingredient. The extra ingredient in this approach is not a spatial information processing inside the machine, but is the way in which the world takes place because of the body. And of course, I don't have time to address this way. For example, I'm working on models that suggest how to build a machine that has the right kind of causal coupling with the external world. And I mean, in this case, my theory produces interesting predictions too, and I'm trying to work on them. So it makes a difference. Maybe I have not been able to satisfy your answer, but yes, it makes a difference. So there are consequences. That's the short answer. If you want, we can talk more in other circumstance, another situation. I would love to address this topic, or you can read I wrote many papers about this topic. You can find them. Basically, just and then I will, because we don't have a lot of time. We are running out of time. Please interrupt me, because I don't want to steal time to other speakers. Interrupt me anytime. But the biggest consequence is that one prediction of my theory is that in order to make a conscious machine, one of the requirements is to make a machine that is able to develop by its own goals, by interacting with the environment. So, for example, if you are familiar with reinforcement learning, where you have predefined hardwire reinforcement criteria, one of the prediction of my theory is that you would need to make a machine able to add new reinforcement criteria. But that's something that, but you can find this stuff in my work. Yeah, if we taught AI what the apple is, can AI look at the 3D printed apple and says that this is that apple which it learned before? Well, AI can make mistakes. We can make mistakes. Once I brought this apple, which is not a real apple, it is a plastic apple, to a conference, and the guy tried to eat it. He just grabbed it, and just to make a joke, he just tried to take a bite out of it. So not only AI, but we can also be fooled by the wrong faked external reality. Include changing in the brain. Yes, the brain too is a physical object. So if the brain changes, let's say because we have more we have more acetylcholine, or because we took drugs, that's a classic example. By taking drugs, we change the chemical balance in the brain. And in my view, that's why when we take drugs, we see different things, because the world relative to our body becomes a different one, because we see the brain as a reference frame. If you change the reference frame, you change the external object. Please feel free to contact me at my website. Feel free to send me objections. I love objections. I think that the theory has to survive to all objections, so we need to face them.